Have you ever noticed how the loudest person in the room rarely holds the most power? Think about that for a moment. In a world where everyone rushes to be seen, to be heard, to be validated, there's something deeply magnetic about the one who chooses silence, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Because silence isn't the absence of power, it's the purest form of it. Most people are terrified of silence. They think it makes them look uncertain, boring, or invisible, so they fill the space with words, noise, and nervous energy. But high-value women, those who truly own themselves, understand something different. They know that silence is a choice, a deliberate, confident, and strategic choice. They don't need to explain themselves to be understood. They don't need to speak to prove their worth. They speak less because their presence already says enough. You see, silence creates space, and in that space, power is born. Power to observe, power to think, power to lead. High-value women don't rush to speak just to avoid awkwardness. They're comfortable with stillness, because stillness is where self-respect lives. And when you stop feeling the need to over-explain, to fill the silence, or to win every conversation, you unlock something far more valuable, your own peace. The truth is, most people listen to respond, not to understand. But silence teaches you to listen differently. It shifts your energy inward. You become aware of your thoughts, your emotions, your boundaries. You start to realize that not everything deserves your reaction. Not every insult deserves a response. Not every situation deserves your energy. This is what makes silence so powerful. It puts you back in control. The woman who masters silence doesn't chase attention. She doesn't fight for validation. She doesn't fear being misunderstood, because she knows her truth doesn't need defending. And that kind of quiet confidence, it commands a room without saying a word. It makes people lean in. It makes people wonder. Because in a world that's constantly shouting, silence stands out. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, this message is for you. If you've been drained from constantly explaining yourself, constantly proving your worth, constantly being the loudest just to be seen, this is your invitation to try something different. Silence isn't weakness, it's not invisibility, it's clarity, it's control, it's power wrapped in grace. And if you stay with this message, if you watch until the end, you'll learn how to use silence as your shield, your strategy, and your strength. You'll discover how to protect your peace, shift power in your favor, and carry yourself with the kind of quiet that makes people respect you instantly. Because the most powerful woman in the room isn't the one who talks the most. It's the one who knows she doesn't have to. And once you understand that, everything begins to change. So don't speak to be heard. Be silent to be understood. Silence isn't just about withholding words. It's about mastering yourself from the inside out. It's the art of choosing peace over chaos, clarity over noise, and strength over reaction. High-value women don't use silence to hide. They use it to lead. Because when you stop reacting to every little thing, you start directing your own life. You stop being pulled by every emotion, every comment, every opinion. You begin to operate from power, not from panic. Most people react because they're afraid of what others might think if they don't. They fear judgment, rejection, and disapproval. But here's the truth. When you need to react, you're handing your power to someone else. You're saying, you control how I feel. High-value women don't give anyone that control. They understand that not every battle is worth fighting, and not every insult deserves attention. When someone tries to provoke them, they don't flinch. They don't defend. They don't engage. Their silence says more than 1,000 words ever could. The strength to stay silent in moments of pressure, in moments of disrespect, in moments of emotional chaos, that strength comes from within. It's not about being cold or distant. It's about having such a deep sense of self-worth that you no longer need to prove anything. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your peace. You don't need to match anyone's energy when that energy is beneath you. You simply rise above it, not with noise, but with grace. Silence is emotional discipline. It's the space between stimulus and response where growth happens. It's the moment when you feel triggered, but choose not to lash out. When you feel misunderstood, but decide not to over-explain. When you feel disrespected, but remain unbothered. That's real power. That's emotional intelligence. That's what separates women who lead from those who follow. And the world feels that energy. People are drawn to those who are calm in the storm, grounded in chaos, still when others are frantic. That kind of presence creates influence. It earns respect. Because in a world addicted to reaction, stillness feels like strength. It tells people you are in control, not just of your mouth, but of your mind, your emotions, and your environment. You become a mirror. The way you carry yourself silently reflects how others should treat you. And the more you lean into that stillness, the more you realize that silence isn't passive, it's incredibly active. It's a choice to rise above, to choose your battles, to protect your energy, to let your actions speak instead of your words. And when you master that, you no longer chase respect. You attract it effortlessly. So if you've been caught in cycles of overreacting, over-explaining, and overthinking, take a breath. You don't have to do that anymore. Your silence is not your weakness. It's your rebirth. The world may try to pull you into noise, but you are made for something higher. Be still. Be calm. Be powerful. Because nothing shakes a woman who knows her silence holds more value than anyone else's opinion. People feel energy long before they understand words. Before you even speak, your silence sends a message. It tells the room how you carry yourself, how you see yourself, and how you expect to be treated. High-value women don't walk in explaining. They walk in embodying. Their energy speaks before they do, and what gives their silence weight is the calm confidence behind it. The unshakable belief that they don't need to be loud to be heard or visible to be respected. That kind of presence isn't built overnight. It's earned through discipline, through choosing self-respect over instant gratification, through letting go of the need to please, to be liked, or to constantly prove something. When you stop performing and start owning your worth, you begin to realize that silence is not just the absence of sound, it's the presence of power. Every time you choose not to argue, not to justify, not to explain yourself to someone who hasn't earned that access, you reclaim your energy. You become rooted, grounded, immovable. There's a quiet that comes when you no longer need the world's approval. A stillness that rises when your self-worth is no longer tied to other people's recognition. That silence becomes your sanctuary. It becomes your filter. It helps you separate what's real from what's noise. You no longer feel the urge to respond to every opinion or participate in every drama. You begin to walk differently, think differently, breathe differently, because you've finally discovered that your value doesn't come from what you say. It comes from what you choose not to say. Most people chase external validation because they've never learned to validate themselves. They speak out of insecurity, out of fear, out of the need to fill a void. But silence, true, intentional silence, requires no performance. It simply is. And in that space, others begin to see you differently. They feel your boundaries without you needing to announce them. They respect your presence without you needing to demand it. This is the kind of silent authority that shifts dynamics. It changes how people approach you. They speak more carefully. They listen more attentively. Because they know you don't give your attention freely. Your silence becomes your filter, allowing only what aligns with your peace to enter. And that's where your real strength begins to grow, not from being unapproachable, but from being unshakable. You begin to understand that silence isn't something you use, it's something you become, a force, a presence, a statement. And when you embrace it fully, you become magnetic. Not because you're trying to impress, but because you've stopped trying at all. You've let go of the noise. You've chosen presence. And people feel that on a level deeper than words. They may not always know why they respect you, why they admire you, why they're drawn to you, but you will. It's because your silence speaks louder than their expectations. And that silence will always be your greatest source of strength. Silence doesn't just influence how others see you, it transforms how you see yourself. When you no longer feel compelled to speak, to explain, or to correct every misunderstanding, you begin to understand your own strength. You start noticing the spaces inside you that were once filled with fear, doubt, and the desperate need to be accepted. And in those empty spaces, confidence grows. Quietly, consistently, unshakably. You begin to understand that silence is a form of self-trust. When you stop rushing to react, you give yourself the chance to feel, to process, to choose. You don't let your emotions drive your actions, you let wisdom guide them. And that self-control is rare. It's rare because it requires patience. It requires inner work. It requires the courage to not prove yourself when everything inside you wants to. But high-value women don't seek to be understood by everyone. They seek to be aligned with themselves. In silence, you hear your real voice. Not the voice shaped by insecurity, not the one molded by approval, but the one anchored in truth. That voice doesn't need to scream to be heard. It doesn't need to justify its decisions, it simply knows. And when you begin to trust that voice more than the noise around you, you become unstoppable. not because you overpower others, but because you no longer compete with them. You rise in a way that doesn't need attention. You rise because you've chosen peace over performance. Most people are addicted to being seen. They fear being invisible. But there is a sacred strength in moving silently, in building quietly, in healing without making a spectacle, in loving yourself behind closed doors without needing the world to clap for your progress. The world teaches you to announce every move. But the most powerful transformations happen in silence, not because they're secret, but because they're sacred. There is a certain power in mystery, a depth in restraint. When you stop offering all of yourself to people who don't deserve your truth, you begin to protect your energy like it's gold. You stop bleeding emotionally for those who only watch. You stop talking just to fill space. Instead, you learn to speak when it matters, and be silent when it's wise. You realize that your silence can be more healing, more commanding, and more revealing than any carefully chosen words. In this space of silence, something else begins to shift. Your boundaries grow stronger, your decisions become clearer, your presence becomes more intentional. People start treating you differently, not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped handing them the parts of you that were meant to be guarded. That's what high value looks like. It's not loud, it's not demanding, it's rooted, it's reserved, it's radiant in its quietness. Let your silence be your sanctuary. Let it remind you of your worth. Let it sharpen your instincts and elevate your presence. Because when you carry silence with strength, you carry a force no one can interrupt. The woman who chooses silence isn't hiding, she's listening. She's observing, discerning, calculating. She's tuned into the energy around her and the energy within her. And in that stillness, she becomes powerful beyond measure. Because silence sharpens perception. It allows you to see what others miss. It gives you the space to hear what's not being said. And when you become that aware, you stop reacting blindly. You stop being controlled by noise, and you start moving with intention. Silence gives birth to clarity, clarity in thought, clarity in boundaries, clarity in decisions. It strips away the chaos and exposes the truth. You begin to see people for who they really are, not just who they pretend to be. You notice patterns, inconsistencies, subtle shifts in behavior. And because you're no longer distracted by the need to speak or impress, you stay centered, grounded, unmoved by appearances. You no longer give your trust to charm or charisma. You give it to consistency, to integrity, to energy that feels aligned with your peace. When you become silent, your energy speaks louder. It starts to set standards without you ever having to voice them. People begin to sense your boundaries, not because you've outlined them, but because you embody them. You become the kind of woman whose absence is felt more deeply than others' presence. And not because you're trying to be mysterious, but because your silence has meaning. It has weight. It comes from depth, not distance. There's a quiet kind of self-worth that radiates without permission. It doesn't need to be validated or applauded. It's built from within. That's what silence cultivates. It forces you to sit with yourself, to face your truth, to strip away the noise of who the world told you to be. And in doing so, you meet the version of yourself that's been waiting underneath it all, the one who doesn't need to perform, please, or prove. This is the kind of transformation that creates resilience. You stop fearing disconnection because you've already learned to be whole on your own. You stop fearing rejection because your value isn't up for negotiation. You stop fearing judgment because your silence has taught you that peace is more valuable than approval. And that's when you become truly free. Free to walk away. Free to say no. Free to hold your standard without shaking. Because your power is no longer in your words. It's in your presence. There's nothing louder than a woman who knows her worth and chooses not to explain it. That kind of silence is unforgettable. It lingers. It teaches. It demands respect without saying a word. And when you master that, you no longer seek power. You become it. You become the calm in chaos, the clarity in confusion, the presence that shifts the energy of every room you enter. Not by force, not by noise, but by being fully, unapologetically, and silently rooted in who you are. When you stop speaking just to fill silence, you start hearing what truly matters. You hear the voice inside that knows what you've been tolerating for too long. The voice that tells you what's no longer aligned, what drains your spirit, what dulls your power. And you can't ignore it anymore, not when you've embraced stillness. Silence amplifies what matters and erases what doesn't. It draws a line between what's real and what's distraction. And in that space, you discover how often you've lowered your standards just to keep the peace with others, while losing the peace within yourself. This is where everything begins to shift. Because once you find that peace within, you start guarding it like your life depends on it. You stop apologizing for your silence. You stop explaining your distance. You stop justifying your decisions. You realize that silence is your filter, not your flaw. It protects your mind, your energy, and your growth. It keeps you aligned with your values instead of pulled into emotional chaos. And when you finally prioritize that, your world changes. You start becoming intentional about everything. Who you give time to, what you engage in, where you invest your thoughts. You choose conversations that uplift instead of drain. You move away from environments that expect you to shrink. You stop arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you. Because silence has taught you this, you don't owe your voice to anyone who hasn't earned your respect. Not everyone deserves access to your emotional world, and not every moment demands your reaction. People will test your silence. They'll confuse it for weakness. They'll push your buttons, hoping to provoke the old version of you. The one who explained herself endlessly, who gave energy to chaos, who broke herself into pieces trying to be understood. But you're not her anymore. Silence taught you that not every reaction is your responsibility. Some things deserve your silence more than your energy. And when you stop giving energy to what's beneath you, your life starts elevating naturally. You carry yourself differently when you no longer need to defend who you are. That's the quiet power of self-respect. You don't shout your worth, you walk in it. You don't beg for space, you take it. You don't chase closure, you create it in your own silence. And suddenly, you realize you're not missing anything. You're not lacking. You're not behind. You were simply too distracted by noise to notice how powerful your stillness is. This is where you rise. Quietly, deeply, authentically. With no performance, no proving, no pleading, just presence. Just peace. Just power that radiates from the inside out. You don't need to be the loudest voice in the room when you're the most grounded. Because the most magnetic energy in the world is a woman who is calm, centered, and silent. Not because she can't speak, but because she doesn't need to. Her power speaks for her. Her silence does the talking. And that, more than anything, commands respect. Silence becomes unshakable when it is rooted in self-awareness. When you finally know who you are, what you value, and what you will no longer accept, you no longer need to explain yourself to anyone. You understand that peace is not found in proving, pleasing, or persuading others. It's found in honoring your own truth. The more you return to that truth, the more powerful your silence becomes. It no longer feels like absence. It feels like presence. Strong, centered, undeniable presence. You begin to notice how silence protects your power from being diluted. Every time you withhold a reaction, you conserve energy. Every time you choose not to explain what doesn't need explaining, you stay in control. You start to detach from the need for external validation, and instead, you build a solid foundation within. That foundation allows you to remain calm when others are chaotic. It keeps you steady when the world around you tries to shake you. And that's when you begin to command attention. Not with noise, but with poise. People sense that difference immediately. They may not know what it is, but they feel it. They recognize something in your energy that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't overextend. It holds, it waits, it watches. And it only engages when it chooses to, not because it needs to. That kind of energy is rare. That kind of energy is respected. Because it's not seeking power, it already knows it holds power. The most powerful people don't move fast to prove something. They move with clarity. They observe before they speak. They measure their words. They don't allow emotions to hijack their response. They don't give everyone access to their sacred space. And silence is what creates that space. It becomes your inner sanctuary, the place where you return to realign, recharge, and reclaim your peace. It's in silence that your intuition sharpens. You begin to feel when something's off, even if it looks perfect. You begin to sense when someone's energy doesn't match their words. You catch the moments when people reveal their true intentions, not through what they say, but through what they don't. And because you've learned not to rush to respond, you give yourself the advantage of clarity. You begin to lead yourself without being led by noise. You stop performing, you stop defending, you stop offering explanations to those who refuse to understand, and instead you walk in truth, in peace, in complete alignment. You let your silence do the talking, and it speaks with more depth than any words could ever carry. Because silence backed by strength is magnetic. It draws people in, but it also draws boundaries. It invites connection, but only with those who honor your energy. This is not avoidance, it's mastery. Mastery of emotion, mastery of presence, mastery of self. And when you master silence, you no longer just survive the noise of the world. You rise above it. You set a new standard, not only for how others treat you, but for how you treat yourself. When your silence is rooted in self-mastery, it becomes more than a habit. It becomes your language. It communicates without effort. It sets standards without words. It tells the world you are not easily shaken, not easily accessed, not easily manipulated. And in a world that rewards the loudest voices, your quiet strength becomes impossible to ignore. It's not just that you choose silence. It's that you've grown so deeply into your identity that you no longer need to convince anyone of it. You simply are, and that presence alone speaks volumes. The power of silence is that it forces others to meet you on a higher level. When you don't rush to fill the air with noise, others are left to confront their own discomfort. Your stillness reveals what their words try to hide. It strips away pretense. It exposes motive. Because when you no longer play into the emotional chaos of others, they can no longer control you. That's where the shift happens. You stop being reactive, and you start becoming a mirror. You reflect truth, not emotion. You reflect clarity, not confusion. You reflect strength, not surrender. Every time you choose silence over conflict, you reclaim your power. Not because you're avoiding truth, but because you're prioritizing peace. Not every battle is worth fighting. Not every opinion deserves a response. Not every challenge requires your voice. You begin to see the difference between what's urgent and what's important. And most of the time, the most important decision is to preserve your energy, not prove your point. This is how emotional control is built. Not through force, but through choice. Through the quiet decisions you make when no one is watching. Through the discipline of withholding reaction when your ego wants to explode. Through the strength to pause, breathe, and respond with intention. And the more you do this, the more your silence transforms from stillness into strategy. You begin to influence without needing attention. You begin to impact without needing applause. There's a dignity that comes from knowing you don't need to be loud to be heard. A confidence that grows when you're no longer triggered by everything around you. You don't flinch at disrespect. You simply remove access. You don't fight for understanding. You create distance. You don't explain your worth, you live it. That's the evolution silence brings. It takes you from proving to knowing, from chasing to attracting, from noise to alignment. Eventually, silence becomes your protection. It guards your energy from being scattered. It shields your vision from being clouded. It keeps you focused on what truly matters. Growth, peace, direction. When the world tries to pull you into drama, you remain unmoved. Not out of arrogance, but out of strength. Because your silence is not emptiness, it's presence. It's wisdom. It's command. And the more you practice it, the more magnetic you become. Not because you shout to be seen, but because your calm cannot be ignored. When you reach the level where silence becomes your natural state, it's not because you have nothing to say. It's because you finally realize that not everything deserves your voice. You no longer chase validation through explanation. You don't dilute your power to be palatable. You don't shrink yourself to ease discomfort. You've outgrown the need to be understood by people who refuse to see beyond their own limited lens. And in that growth, you discover an inner calm so profound that no external noise can penetrate it. This is the calm that comes from clarity. Clarity about who you are, what you value, and what you will no longer tolerate. You no longer live to appease expectations. You no longer feel guilty for protecting your peace. You've learned that silence is not withdrawal, it's refinement. It's filtering what gets your time, what gets your thoughts, and what gets your emotional investment. And when you move from that place, everything about you shifts. You become more intentional, more selective, more powerful. Because your silence has become the gatekeeper of your life. It's in silence that you learn to choose presence over performance. You no longer act to impress. You don't posture to gain attention. You're grounded, rooted, clear. You don't chase outcomes. You align with values. You don't force connections. You let energy speak. And that's what makes you unshakable. You've removed the need for noise. You've silenced the inner critic. You've silenced the outer chaos. And now, your voice carries weight because it's no longer wasted. People notice when a woman speaks less but moves more deliberately. When she doesn't announce her boundaries, she lives them. When she doesn't explain her worth, she embodies it. When she doesn't argue about respect, she enforces it through silence. That's the kind of presence that shifts rooms, changes conversations, and redefines standards. not because you ask for it, but because your energy demands it. The more you embrace silence, the more you align with your inner compass. You begin making decisions from a place of strength, not scarcity. You stop overthinking because you trust your intuition. You stop defending yourself because you know your value. You stop engaging in meaningless conflict because you see through the illusion of urgency. Everything slows down. But in that stillness, your power multiplies. You're no longer impulsive. You're intentional, strategic, grounded. This is where freedom begins. The freedom to speak only when necessary. The freedom to walk away without a word. The freedom to choose peace over pride, clarity over chaos, strength over reaction. Your silence isn't passive, it's purposeful. It's not absence, it's presence without noise. And in that presence you become untouchable, not because you're cold, but because you're whole. You've reclaimed your power by choosing stillness over struggle, self-respect over approval, and purpose over performance. This is the transformation silence brings, not just in how others see you, but in how you now see yourself. When your silence is grounded in self-respect, it no longer feels like withholding, it feels like rising. You start to recognize the value of your energy. You no longer offer it where it's not honored. You no longer speak just to fill space or calm discomfort. You sit with the weight of your presence, unbothered by expectations. Because now you understand something most people never learn. Your silence is not weakness, it is power under control. It is emotional maturity. It is the refusal to perform for people who haven't earned access to the real you. Every time you resist the urge to defend, argue, or explain, you're reinforcing your strength. Not the kind of strength that needs to be loud, but the kind that stands on truth. The kind that doesn't flinch in the face of judgment. The kind that no longer feels the need to win every debate or respond to every provocation. You have nothing to prove, you have nothing to chase. You've already arrived at a level where peace is more valuable than attention, where silence is more satisfying than validation, where self-respect speaks louder than any words ever could. You begin to separate yourself from environments that drain you. Not with drama, not with explanation, but with quiet, firm distance. You don't need closure from people who never gave you clarity. You don't need apologies to forgive. You don't need noise to find direction. You create space. Space to think. Space to feel. Space to grow. And within that space, your identity expands. You find the freedom to live for yourself, not through the eyes of others. This is the power of emotional discipline. The ability to stay still when everything around you screams for reaction. The ability to listen more than you speak. To wait when you could rush. To rise when you could sink. You stop feeding your emotions with chaos. You stop rewarding disrespect with attention. And instead you build a life that reflects the strength of your silence, not just outwardly, but inwardly. In how you think, in how you carry yourself, in how you choose what deserves your energy. Silence becomes your armor, not to shut the world out, but to keep your power in. You start filtering conversations not by how loud someone is, but by how aligned they are. You stop negotiating with noise. You stop reacting to low vibrations. You stay rooted in your own truth, even when others misunderstand it. Because you finally realize the loudest voices rarely speak the deepest truths. The deepest truths come in quiet moments, in stillness, in clarity, in calm. When you embrace silence from a place of power, everything in your life begins to shift. You attract different people. You face challenges with poise. You move through the world with an unshakable presence, not because you force it, but because you've earned it. And the more you stand in that quiet power, the more undeniable you become, not through words, but through unwavering self-respect. You become a different force entirely when your silence is not born from fear but from wisdom. You begin to see how much noise in the world is just distraction. People shouting to be seen, arguing to be right, performing to feel valuable. But when you stop needing any of that, when you no longer depend on external chaos to validate your inner worth, you begin to live on a different frequency. One where your peace is non-negotiable. One where your energy is preserved like gold. One where your silence is not a gap in communication. It is the purest form of expression. You learn to pause, not because you're uncertain, but because you're intentional. You let others rush. You let them overshare. You let them seek approval in places you've outgrown. While they chase noise, you build clarity. While they react emotionally, you respond consciously. You see through games because you're not playing them. You see through drama because you're not feeding it. You see through manipulation because your silence gives you space to observe. And in that stillness, you start making decisions not from pain, but from power. Not from pressure, but from presence. You stop explaining your boundaries. You stop negotiating your peace. You stop apologizing for standards you fought hard to build. Because when you finally understand your value, silence becomes sacred. It becomes the ground where self-respect grows. You no longer tolerate what insults your intuition. You don't stay in spaces that rob you of peace just to appear polite. You don't entertain conversations that cost you clarity. You know your worth, and your silence protects it. This level of restraint builds a new kind of influence, one not based on volume but on vibration. People feel your presence even when you say nothing. They sense your power because it's not reactive, it's refined. You no longer need to be loud to be noticed. You don't seek to be understood by everyone because you've already accepted yourself fully. That quiet acceptance makes you magnetic. It draws in those aligned with your values and repels those who can't match your depth. There is strength in staying silent when chaos invites you in. There is wisdom in choosing peace when ego begs for a reaction. There is power in knowing that your energy doesn't belong everywhere. And the more you embody this truth, the less you feel the need to explain yourself. Because silence is not about holding back, it's about knowing what's worth releasing. It's about choosing what deserves your presence, your words, your time. Your silence becomes your filter, your protection, your statement. And through it you rise. You rise above noise, above doubt, above emotional instability. Not because you're detached, but because you're deeply connected. To yourself, to your values, to your purpose. That's the true power of silence. It's not about what you withhold. It's about what you no longer give away freely. You own yourself now. And in that ownership, you become unstoppable. There is a calm power in being unshakable. When your mind is no longer enslaved by the need to react, you gain an edge most people never develop. Silence gives you that edge. It sharpens your self-awareness. It separates impulse from intention. It puts space between the trigger and your response, giving you control. And control, real, internal control, is freedom. The more you master your inner world, the less the outer world can pull you out of character. That is where your strength lies. Not in how loudly you fight back, but in how effortlessly you rise above. You begin to recognize that silence isn't about doing less. It's about being more grounded, more thoughtful, more present. You no longer feel the urge to chase conversations that go nowhere. You stop feeling anxious when others misunderstand you. You no longer shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You understand that your energy is a gift and not everyone is meant to hold it. Your silence becomes a statement, not of avoidance, but of intention. You decide where your energy flows. You decide what deserves your response. You become the gatekeeper of your peace. This is what makes high-value women unforgettable. Their silence is not passive, it's decisive. They don't react to chaos because they've made peace their priority. They don't explain every choice because they know their worth isn't up for discussion. They don't chase attention because they've already claimed their value. This kind of silence comes from deep alignment. It's not about withholding, it's about refining, it's about cutting through noise and choosing presence. It's about knowing that not every situation needs your voice, some just need your absence. In this silence, you start hearing your own truth more clearly. You no longer silence yourself to please others. Instead, you silence the world to listen to yourself. And what you hear is powerful. You hear your boundaries becoming firm. You hear your intuition getting louder. You hear your needs without guilt. You hear your voice within, stronger than the demands outside. That inner clarity is your compass. And with it, you begin making decisions that honor your evolution, not your fears. You stop being available to chaos. You stop being reachable to anyone who hasn't done the work to meet you where you are. Your silence is not about shutting people out, it's about aligning with who you've become. And who you've become doesn't settle, doesn't chase, doesn't beg to be seen. She chooses herself, again and again, until the world adjusts to her presence. That's the kind of power silence gives you. The ability to shift the atmosphere without raising your voice. To change the direction of your life without announcing it. To reclaim your energy without needing permission. Because once you realize your silence holds more power than your words ever did, you stop giving away your peace to prove your worth. You've already proven it by becoming the woman who doesn't need to speak to be heard. You no longer wait for the world to grant you permission to stand in your power. You no longer explain your silence to make others feel comfortable. When you hold your peace with intention, you realize that not everyone deserves access to the depths of your mind, the softness of your heart, or the fire of your spirit. Silence becomes your shield, not because you're hiding, but because you've chosen to protect what's sacred. You've learned that the strongest people are not those who fight the loudest battles, but those who master the quiet war within and come out calmer, clearer, and unshaken. There is a deep, almost magnetic confidence in a woman who knows she doesn't need to say much to be taken seriously. She commands the room not with volume, but with presence. She doesn't beg to be understood because she already understands herself. Her silence is a boundary. Her quiet is full of wisdom. Her stillness holds weight. And that presence becomes undeniable. Because when you stop proving and start preserving, people can feel the shift. You become the storm they can't predict and the calm they can't shake. You walk into situations with clarity, with restraint, with inner peace that refuses to be disturbed. You've stopped asking for clarity from confusion. You've stopped expecting truth from chaos. You've stopped inviting validation from those who can't even validate themselves. This is the power of choosing silence. It keeps you grounded in a world that wants you reactive. It helps you regulate your emotional energy in environments that drain it. It teaches you that not everything requires your voice, your time, or your correction. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away without a word, not out of weakness, but out of strength. The more you protect your energy, the more you see how much you were giving away before. Every explanation, every overreaction, every time you argued to defend your worth, it was a leak in your power. Now, you've patched those leaks with silence. You've chosen to redirect your focus from proving to preserving, from reacting to observing, from pleasing to protecting. And in doing so, you've become untouchable in the best way, unreachable to drama, unavailable to toxicity, unbothered by noise. Your silence is not emptiness, it is space for your soul to breathe, to build, and to thrive. You are not here to explain your evolution. You are not responsible for how others interpret your silence. You don't owe anyone access to your energy just because they ask for it. What you owe is your loyalty to the version of you that fought for peace, the version that decided she was done sacrificing herself just to be heard. That version of you is alive now, standing tall in the fullness of your power. And from this place, you don't raise your voice, you raise your vibration. You don't shout your value, you embody it. You don't react, you rise. And you rise in silence, with dignity, with clarity, and with power that cannot be denied. There comes a point where you stop chasing noise and start chasing peace. You stop looking for approval and start looking inward. You stop asking the world to see you and finally begin seeing yourself. And when that shift happens, your silence becomes golden, not because it hides your truth, but because it reveals your strength. You understand that not everyone deserves a front row seat to your transformation. Some people only knew you in your chaos. They wouldn't recognize your peace if it stood right in front of them. And that's why you stay silent. Not to shut them out, but to protect the new you from being dragged into the old you. You've outgrown the need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You've outgrown arguments that drain your soul. You've outgrown trying to explain your boundaries to those who only benefit when you have none. Your silence is no longer a gap to be filled. It's a wall that guards your progress. And when you sit in that silence long enough, you realize you're no longer waiting for others to change. You've changed. And your energy now speaks a language that only the aligned can hear. Let others be confused by your calm. Let them wonder why you don't react like you used to. That's growth. That's self-control. That's elevation. When you don't respond, it's not because you're weak. It's because you've built something within yourself that is no longer shaken by petty provocations. You're not silent because you have nothing to say. You're silent because what you've built internally is too valuable to risk over temporary noise. And that discipline, that fierce, unwavering emotional control, is the most powerful statement you could ever make. This is where your real beauty begins to shine. Not in your appearance, not in your charm, but in the way you carry yourself when things around you beg for a reaction and you still choose restraint. The way you prioritize your peace, even when chaos knocks louder. The way you step back not out of fear, but out of self-respect. That kind of presence leaves an impression that words never could. It shows you are no longer emotionally available to every storm. You've trained your nervous system to choose calm, even when it's hard. And in doing so, you've become dangerous in the best possible way, because you cannot be manipulated through noise. When you rise through silence, you rise with grace. You rise with discipline. You rise with clarity. You're no longer proving your worth. You're protecting your peace. And that changes everything. Because once you master the power of not reacting, you become untouchable. Not because you don't feel, but because you've learned to filter what gets your attention. And from that place, you stop surviving and start leading. You stop defending and start deciding. You stop reacting and start ruling your own life. In silence, you've found the clearest voice of all, your own. And now, nothing can take that away from you. You no longer need to shout to be heard, because your energy speaks volumes before you ever open your mouth. When your silence is rooted in self-awareness, it becomes your power, not your weakness. You begin to understand that not every situation deserves your words, and not every person earns the right to hear your truth. You stop giving away pieces of yourself in hopes that someone will finally understand. You stop pleading to be seen. You start choosing peace over validation, stillness over chaos, and purpose over people-pleasing. This is not withdrawal, it's wisdom. It's the wisdom of someone who knows their worth is no longer up for negotiation. You grow tired of conversations that go in circles, of explaining yourself to people who listen only to respond, not to understand. You realize silence isn't passive, it's decisive. It says, I no longer need to win you over. It draws a line between who you were and who you've become. Because real transformation isn't loud. It doesn't beg for recognition. It happens in the quiet spaces where you begin to see yourself clearly and finally refuse to shrink just to make others comfortable. You step into your life not with noise, but with certainty. Not with rage, but with unshakable calm. This kind of silence demands presence. It takes emotional maturity to sit with your feelings, observe them, and choose not to let them dictate your response. It takes strength to stay grounded when provoked, strength to stay soft in a world that rewards aggression, strength to walk away, not to avoid conflict, but because you respect your inner state too much to hand it over to chaos. That's the kind of strength that turns silence into a statement, a declaration that you are no longer available for battles that cost your peace. When you master this, people feel it. They don't hear your voice. They feel your energy. They sense the boundaries without needing to be told. They recognize the shift in you, and some may fall away because they can't manipulate the version of you who no longer explains, no longer defends, no longer justifies. Let them go. Growth often offends the ones who benefited from your silence when it came from fear, not strength. Now your silence is intentional. Now it's an act of power, not submission. And here's the truth. When you begin to protect your energy this fiercely, everything changes. The way you walk into a room, the way you make decisions, the way you carry yourself when no one is watching. You realize that your power was never in what you could say. It was in what you could choose not to say. And that restraint, that discipline, that control, that's what sets you apart. That's what turns you into someone unstoppable. Because once you learn to stay silent, not out of fear, but out of control, no one can pull you back into the noise you fought so hard to rise above. When your silence is anchored in self-respect, it becomes a shield that noise cannot penetrate. You no longer feel the urge to correct every misunderstanding or respond to every challenge. Because deep down, you've realized that the people who truly understand you don't need explanations. And the ones who demand them often aren't listening anyway. You stop wasting energy trying to be understood in spaces that were never meant for your truth. You let go of the chase for approval. That craving to be liked, accepted, validated, it fades when your inner world becomes more important than outer applause. You start to notice how much power there is in pausing, how clarity is often born in silence. When you stop reacting to every trigger, you gain something rare, control over your mind. And when you control your mind, you control your life. You don't get pulled into drama, you don't spiral into emotional traps, you simply observe, you watch, you wait, and you act with intention. That level of presence intimidates people who rely on chaos to stay relevant. But you're not here to be loud, you're here to be effective. High-value individuals aren't consumed with proving themselves. Their energy speaks before their words do. They're deliberate. They understand that silence can reveal more than 1,000 words ever could. Because silence is uncomfortable for the insecure. It's threatening for the manipulative. It exposes the truth for those who hide behind distractions. When you master silence, you begin to see through the noise. You spot the patterns. You recognize who's trying to provoke you, who's trying to pull you into their storm, who's seeking your reaction to feel powerful. And you give them nothing. This doesn't make you cold. It makes you conscious. It makes you wise enough to know that some situations don't deserve your voice, they deserve your absence. You don't always need to make a point. Sometimes the point is made by your refusal to engage. That's when your silence becomes a boundary, a loud, unshakable declaration that your peace is non-negotiable. You stop running after closure, stop begging to be seen, Stop fighting to be heard in places that thrive on misunderstanding. You rise in your own calm, and that stillness is deafening. In a world addicted to noise, your silence becomes your rebellion. It sets you apart. It teaches others how to treat you, and more importantly, it teaches you how to treat yourself. With care, with dignity, with discipline. You stop giving your power to those who don't value it. You stop bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand you a bandage. You learn that silence isn't empty, it's full of answers. And when you trust those answers, you stop second-guessing your worth. You start moving differently, standing taller, breathing deeper, not because life got easier, but because you finally decided that protecting your energy matters more than proving your point. That shift, that silent decision, is where real power begins. When you stop explaining yourself, you begin evolving. Silence becomes the signal that you've outgrown the need for external validation. You stop shrinking to fit into conversations that don't nourish you. You stop watering down your truth for the comfort of those who haven't done the inner work. That shift is powerful, not because you've said something profound, but because you've chosen not to waste your breath. You're no longer negotiating your peace. You're preserving it. And that preservation of peace is the beginning of personal power. There is something magnetic about a person who doesn't rush to speak, who listens, observes, and chooses their words like a master craftsman selects their tools. With care, with restraint, and with purpose. Silence makes space for the mind to rise above chaos. It allows you to respond instead of react. And in that gap, you find clarity. You start asking better questions. You start noticing patterns. You become less about proving and more about protecting. Less about being seen and more about seeing clearly. That clarity sharpens your instincts and strengthens your boundaries. You start realizing that not everyone deserves access to you. Not every situation requires your opinion, and not every attack deserves a response. The moment you grasp that truth, you stop being reactive and start being strategic, because people who are easily triggered are easily manipulated. But when you hold your ground in silence, you hold your power. You stop dancing to the beat of someone else's chaos. You choose stillness over struggle, and that stillness becomes your sanctuary. The strongest version of you doesn't chase approval. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't engage with noise. It moves quietly, speaks intentionally, and chooses peace over popularity. You begin to realize that maturity is when you stay silent, not because you have nothing to say, but because you know not everything deserves your energy. That decision made consistently is what builds inner strength. You're no longer tossed around by external drama. You become anchored, unshaken, focused. When you no longer feel the need to explain who you are, you begin attracting people who already understand, people who are grounded, people who respect energy instead of demanding attention. That shift changes everything, because the moment you stop pouring into unworthy cups, you start overflowing into your own. You refill your spirit. You reclaim your mind. You rise, not because you're trying to be better than anyone, but because you finally remembered who you are without the noise. Silence isn't weakness. It's the doorway to wisdom. It's the posture of someone who values their peace over pointless debates. It's the mindset of someone who chooses elevation over confrontation. And once you step into that mindset, your entire energy changes. You stop being accessible to chaos. You stop being vulnerable to manipulation. You become untouchable, not because you're cold, but because you're clear. And in that clarity, you rise, not louder, but higher. Not to be seen, but to be free.